One evening, while I was walking toward the market, the road felt unusually quiet. Then a truck came speeding toward me, reckless, out of control. The driver had fallen asleep. I froze. I fell to the ground, and in that moment, I truly believed my life was ending there. What happened next still doesn't feel real. The same bird I once fed at my door, the bird I thought had flown away forever, came back and saved my life. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and stay with me, because to understand why that bird mattered so much, you first need to hear what it feels like when, at a young age, you watch your beautiful wife walk away with another man, leaving you behind with 2 small children and a life that never followed the plan you believed in. I live in a house most people don't even notice anymore. It stands at the edge of a narrow road, far from the noise of towns, far from places where people still greet each other by name. The paint on the walls has faded into a dull, tired color, and the wooden door creaks even when the wind barely touches it. Every morning after the sun rises just enough to warm the front steps, I sit there quietly, not waiting for anyone in particular, just letting the day arrive on its own terms. I am retired now. I worked for decades in a place where time was counted by whistles and clocks, where my value was measured by hours and output. When that ended, so did most of the voices in my life. Silence became my regular companion, heavier than any workload I ever carried. It was during one of those silent mornings that I noticed her. A little bird, no bigger than my palm, hopping nervously near the top corner of my doorframe. She carried thin twigs in her beak, struggling to balance them against the old wood. The wind pushed her work away again and again, dropping the fragile pieces onto the ground. Most people would have brushed her off, annoyed by the mess, but something in her persistence stopped me. I watched her for a long time before I moved. She reminded me of effort without complaint, of trying without knowing whether it would ever be enough. I placed a small bowl of water near the door and scattered a few grains where she could see them. I didn't speak loudly. I didn't need to. In a house where words had lost their purpose, quiet gestures felt more honest. From that day on, she returned, every morning, every evening. Slowly, the nest began to take shape, clinging to the same place as if the house itself had agreed to keep her secret. I found myself talking to her without realizing it. Not full conversations, just pieces of my thoughts, fragments of a life I never organized properly. I told her how this house wasn't always this empty, how once there were small shoes scattered near the door, how laughter used to leak through the windows whether I wanted it or not. She tilted her head when I spoke, as if listening, as if memory itself had wings. As the days passed, feeding her became routine. And with routine came old memories, the kind you think are buried until something small digs them up. I told her about my job, the one that kept me away more than it kept me secure. I believed I was building a future by being absent from the present. I told her about my wife, how love doesn't always break loudly, sometimes it simply walks away. She left with another man while I was still learning how to come home tired and quiet. She left behind 2 children, a little boy and a little girl, both too young to understand why adults disappear without explaining themselves. The bird didn't fly away when I spoke of these things. She stayed, feathers ruffled by the breeze, nest held together by fragile trust. And in that stillness, sitting at the doorway of a life already lived, I realized something I hadn't admitted in years. I wasn't telling my story because I wanted sympathy. I was telling it because for the first time in a long while, something was there to hear it without judgment, without expectation, without leaving. After my wife left, the house did not change all at once. It emptied slowly, like a river drying up after the rain has already passed. Her clothes disappeared first, then the sound of her footsteps, then the small habits that used to irritate me when I was younger and thought irritation meant independence. What remained were 2 children who looked at me with questions I did not know how to answer. A little boy who followed me from room to room, holding the edge of my shirt as if I might vanish too. And a little girl who watched everything quietly, learning the world by observing pain before joy. I did not blame them for what had happened. I blame myself in ways I never spoke aloud, because some guilt becomes heavier when you try to explain it. I went back to work with a different kind of tiredness. Not the physical exhaustion I was used to, but the kind that settles behind the eyes and never fully leaves. I woke before sunrise, packed their small lunches, tied shoes that were too big for their feet, and walked them to places where other adults promised to look after them while I earned money to keep us alive. At night, when the house fell silent again, I sat between their beds, listening to their breathing, counting it like proof that I had at least managed one thing correctly. People talk about strength as if it is loud and visible. Mine was quiet, built from routine and fear, held together by responsibility rather than courage. The day my son died did not announce itself as tragedy. It arrived like any other day, ordinary and careless. He had been unwell, nothing dramatic, nothing that makes people rush or panic. A fever that refused to settle, a small body too fragile to fight what adults underestimate. I remember holding him while waiting, believing time would behave the way it always had, believing that effort alone could negotiate with fate. It couldn't. By evening, the room felt different, heavier, as if the air itself had accepted something I was still denying. When he was gone, there was no scream in me. There was only a hollow space where noise used to live. After that, the world narrowed. I moved through days like a man underwater, watching life continue at a distance I could no longer cross. My daughter became my anchor, though she was still a child herself. I learned how to braid her hair, how to pretend confidence during school meetings, how to smile at neighbors who meant well but never stayed long enough to understand. I did not talk about my son. I packed his things away carefully, not because I wanted to forget, but because some memories demand too much oxygen to keep nearby. At night, when the bird slept above my door years later, I would sometimes think of him, of how small hands hold onto life without knowing how easily it slips away. Raising my daughter alone changed me in ways I didn't recognize until much later. I became cautious with happiness, respectful of silence, careful not to love recklessly. I watched her grow stronger, taller, more certain of a future I could no longer picture for myself. And as I told the bird these things, sitting at my door with grains in my palm and years on my shoulders, I understood something painful and simple at the same time. Loss does not end a life. It reshapes it quietly, permanently, leaving you to learn a new version of living without ever asking if you are ready. My daughter grew up in a house that had learned how to be quiet, not the uncomfortable kind of silence that follows an argument, but a careful one, built from understanding and restraint. She learned early not to ask about her brother. I never told her not to, yet somehow she knew. Children sense the places adults cannot walk without breaking. Instead, she filled the space with small victories. Good marks in school, borrowed library books. Careful smiles meant to reassure me more than herself. I watched her become responsible too quickly, the way children do when life teaches them that someone must always be strong. As the years passed, she became my reason for waking up with intention. Every decision I made revolved around her future, even when I pretended otherwise. I worked longer hours, saved what little I could, and taught her the difference between wanting and needing. I never spoke badly about her mother, not because I forgave easily, but because I didn't want bitterness to become something she inherited. Some wounds should end with us, even if they never fully heal. When she asked why it was only the two of us, I told her the truth in its simplest form, that people sometimes choose different paths, and that it wasn't her fault. She accepted that answer the way children accept gravity, not fully understanding it, but trusting it would always be there. By the time she turned 18, the house felt smaller, as if it already knew she was preparing to leave. She met someone kind enough, someone young and certain about the world, in a way I no longer was. I saw the change in her before she said anything. The way she lingered less at home, the way her eyes looked beyond our walls. When she told me she was engaged, I smiled without hesitation. I hugged her, held her longer than necessary, and told her I was proud. And I meant it. Pride and loneliness can exist in the same moment without cancelling each other out. When she left, she didn't leave behind anger or unfinished arguments. She packed carefully, thanked me for things I thought were simply duties, and promised to visit. She believed that promises age the same way love does. I watched her walk away from the doorway where, years later, a bird would build her nest. I stood there long after she disappeared, not waiting for her to return, just letting the sound of her absence settle into the walls. The house once again adjusted to having only one heartbeat inside it. Retirement came quietly, like everything else in my life. No celebration, no long speeches, just a final day and an empty morning after it. With my work finished and my daughter living a life that no longer required my supervision, I moved away from the place that held too many echoes. I found this remote house because it asked nothing of me. No memories attached, no expectations. Just land, sky, and time moving slowly enough to notice. And it was here, in this quiet, after all the leaving was done, that a small bird chose my door as the place to begin her own story. Life in this place settled into a rhythm that did not require explanation. Days passed without names, measured only by light and shadow. I woke with the sun, walked the short path to the market when supplies ran low, and returned before the afternoon heat made the road feel endless. No one asked about my past here, and I never volunteered it. Some histories are easier to carry when no one knows their weight. The house remained simple, almost bare. Yet it felt honest in a way my earlier life never quite did. Nothing here pretended to last forever. The bird grew alongside the seasons. What began as a fragile presence became something strong and unmistakable. Her wings widened, her movements grew confident, and the nest above my door, once delicate, now held firm against wind and rain. I watched this change without interfering, understanding that care does not always mean control. There came a morning when she did not return. The doorway felt unusually empty, as if something small had been taken from it. I did not search for her. I knew better than to chase what was meant to leave. Still, I left grain where I always had, out of habit more than hope. She came back days later, landing briefly before flying off again, testing the world beyond the doorframe. Soon her visits became less frequent. I sat there, listening to the air, realizing how familiar this feeling was. People arrive needing shelter, then grow strong enough to move on. That truth had followed me my entire life, from my wife to my daughter to this bird who owed me nothing. Yet this time, the leaving did not feel like punishment. It felt natural, almost necessary. One afternoon, while walking toward the market with a small bag in my hand, the road ahead shimmered with heat. The sound of an engine grew louder than it should have on such a quiet stretch. A truck appeared, moving too fast, drifting slightly from its line. I froze, my body slower than my fear. In that instant, age caught up with me. My legs gave way, and I fell hard onto the road, unable to move, unable to shout loudly enough to matter. The driver's head was tilted forward, eyes closed, exhaustion steering more than hands. Then the air changed. A sudden rush, a shadow cutting across the sunlight. The bird, grown powerful, unmistakable, struck the front glass of the truck with a force that shattered its stillness. The impact startled the driver awake. He jerked the wheel, panic replacing sleep, and the truck veered off the road, crashing into a nearby tree. The sound echoed across the open land, violent and final. When the dust settled, people rushed in from nowhere, drawn by noise and confusion. No one was dead. Injuries, yes, but lives remained intact. As I sat there on the roadside, heart racing, hands shaking, I looked toward the sky, half expecting emptiness. Instead, I saw her circle once before disappearing beyond the trees. Later, when I returned home, sore and exhausted, she was there, perched quietly above the door, as if she had never left at all. And for the first time in many years, I felt something unfamiliar settle inside my chest. Not relief, not gratitude, something gentler. The quiet understanding that sometimes, even after everyone else has gone, something remembers you well enough to come back. Recovery was slow, but it was honest. My body reminded me daily of its limits, aching in places I hadn't noticed before, moving with a caution that came not from fear, but from awareness. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by with questions, curiosity thinly disguised as concern. They spoke about the accident, about luck, about how close it had been. Some mentioned the bird, laughing softly as if it were a strange coincidence, a story to be retold lightly at tea shops. I listened without correcting them. There are moments that lose their meaning when explained too clearly. The bird did not leave after that day. She stayed near the house, not bound by need, not waiting for food, but choosing the space as if it had become part of her understanding of the world. Sometimes she disappeared for hours, sometimes for an entire day, yet she always returned before night settled fully. I no longer worried when she flew away. I had learned the difference between absence and abandonment. One is temporary, the other is final. She taught me that without ever meaning to. I began speaking less about my past and more about the present, not because the memories had softened, but because they no longer demanded constant attention. I noticed small things again, the way light changed the color of the wall at dusk, the sound of wings cutting through still air, the comfort of sitting at my door without expecting anything from the day. The loneliness I once carried so heavily did not vanish, but it changed shape. It no longer felt like proof of failure. It felt like space, quiet, open, survivable. Sometimes I wondered about my daughter. I imagined her life unfolding somewhere far from this road, busy and full, as it should be. I did not resent her for leaving. Watching the bird grow, leave, and return had taught me something I had missed before. Love is not proven by staying forever. It is proven by what remains when staying is no longer required. If she remembered me kindly, that was enough. If she did not, I would still be grateful for the years I was allowed to be her world. In the evenings, as the bird settled near the nest that never fully disappeared, I understood the quiet lesson life had been repeating all along. Everything that matters comes without guarantee. Children grow, people leave, strength fades, but connection, real connection, does not always follow human rules. Sometimes it arrives with wings, stays without promises, and returns without being asked. And in that gentle, unexpected loyalty, I found something I had not felt since my younger days. Not hope for the future, and not regret for the past, but peace with the life that remained. Time did not stop after the accident. It never does. It simply slowed down in a way that forced me to notice it. Days stretched longer, not because there was more to do, but because I had fewer reasons to rush through them. My body healed unevenly, teaching me patience the hard way. Some mornings I woke up feeling almost like the man I used to be. Other mornings I needed both hands on the wall just to stand. Age is not a single moment of decline. It is a series of quiet negotiations with your own strength, and most of them happen without witnesses. The bird became part of those negotiations. She would sit near the door when I struggled to bend down, watching with a stillness that felt deliberate. I stopped feeding her out of obligation and began doing it out of habit, the way people continue small rituals long after they have forgotten why they started them. Sometimes I wondered if she understood how close I had come to disappearing from this place entirely. Not death exactly, but erasure, the kind where life continues without leaving a mark that anyone notices. If the accident had ended differently, There would have been a brief mention, perhaps a short prayer, and then the road would have returned to silence. I thought often about the people who had once shaped my life so completely. My wife, whose absence still echoed in the corners of memory I rarely visited. My son, frozen forever at an age that never learned disappointment. My daughter, walking into a future that no longer included me at its center. For years, I believed these losses defined me, that they were the sum total of who I had become. But sitting at my door, watching a creature who owed me nothing choose my presence again and again, I began to see those memories differently. They were chapters, not conclusions. Painful, yes. Permanent, perhaps. But not the only story I was allowed to tell myself. The accident changed the way people looked at me, if only briefly. Some saw me as lucky, others saw me as fragile. Both were wrong in their own way. Luck is not surviving danger. Luck is finding meaning afterward. And fragility does not begin with weakness. It begins when you stop believing you are worth protecting. I had lived dangerously close to that belief for years, mistaking isolation for acceptance. It was easier to live quietly than to risk disappointment. Easier to be alone than to hope for connection that might leave again. The bird challenged that thinking without ever making a sound. She stayed when staying made no sense. She returned when leaving would have been easier. And in doing so, she forced me to confront something uncomfortable, that I had spent much of my life assuming departure was inevitable, and therefore preparing myself to feel nothing when it happened. That preparation had hardened into habit, and habit had disguised itself as wisdom. But it wasn't wisdom. It was fear wearing the clothes of experience. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the road emptied of even the occasional passerby, I found myself speaking aloud again. Not recounting the past this time, but acknowledging the present. I told the bird about the accident, not as a miracle or a warning, but as a turning point I hadn't asked for. I admitted how close I had come to believing my life no longer mattered beyond my own quiet routines. Saying it out loud did not weaken me, it steadied me. Some truths only lose their power once they are named. I began to walk a little farther each day, leaning on a stick not out of shame, but practicality. I returned from the market with small items I didn't strictly need, fresh fruit, better grain, even a simple chair to place near the door so sitting would not strain my back. These were not grand changes, no dramatic reinvention, just small acknowledgements that I intended to stay, that I was not done occupying space in the world, that surviving was not enough anymore. I wanted to remain present. At night, when sleep came unevenly, I listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the creak of wood, the distant call of other birds, the soft certainty of breathing. I no longer imagined myself as a man waiting for life to end quietly. I saw myself as someone who had been given one last, unexpected responsibility, not to raise a child, not to build a career, but to remain open to connection, however brief or unusual. Open to the idea that meaning does not always arrive through blood or obligation. The bird never became a symbol in my mind. I did not turn her into a message or a lesson. She was simply there. And perhaps that was the point. Life does not always offer explanations. Sometimes it offers presence instead. And for a man who had lost so much to absence, that presence was more than enough. As the weeks passed, something inside me began to shift in a way I had not expected and certainly had not planned for. It was not happiness, not the kind people talk about when they speak of second chances or new beginnings. It was quieter than that. It was a sense of weight returning to my days, not burden, but meaning. For the first time since retirement, I woke up knowing the day mattered, even if no one else would notice how I spent it. People in the nearby area slowly stopped talking about the accident. Stories fade quickly when there is no spectacle left to feed them. The truck was repaired, the road returned to its familiar emptiness, and the tree that had stopped disaster bore its scars in silence. I, however, did not forget, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I understood now how close life always is to being interrupted, how fragile the line is between walking home and never arriving at all. And strangely, that knowledge did not make me anxious. It made me careful in the right ways. The bird remained part of my mornings and evenings, though our relationship never turned into something people would call companionship. She did not perch on my shoulder or wait for my voice. She simply existed alongside me. Some days she kept her distance, observing from above. Other days she came close enough that I could hear the soft sound of her wings folding. That balance felt important. We were not filling each other's emptiness. We were sharing space without demanding ownership. I began thinking differently about the people who had left my life, not with resentment and not even with sadness, but with understanding that arrived late and uninvited. My wife had chosen something she believed would save her. My daughter had chosen a future that needed room to grow. Even my son, in his brief presence, had given me something permanent, a depth of love that never faded, even after loss. For years, I had arranged these memories into a story of abandonment. Now, they looked more like movements in a larger pattern I had been too tired to see. One afternoon, while cleaning near the door, I found a small object tucked behind an old wooden panel. A photograph I had forgotten I brought with me when I moved here. It showed my children when they were very young, standing close together, unaware of how quickly time would pull them apart. I sat down with that photograph longer than I intended to. There was no pain in it anymore, only distance. Distance, I realized, is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is simply the shape life takes when it keeps moving. That evening the bird returned later than usual. The sky had already darkened, and the air carried the quiet tension that comes before night fully settles. I felt a familiar flicker of concern, the old instinct to worry about what I could not control. But I let it pass. When she arrived, landing firmly near the door as if to reassure me, I understood something important. Trust does not mean certainty. It means accepting uncertainty without panic. That lesson had taken me a lifetime to learn. I stopped thinking of myself as a man waiting for someone to come back. I was no longer waiting for my daughter's visit, or my wife's regret, or even forgiveness for things I could not undo. Waiting had shaped too much of my life already. Instead, I began living with the simple intention of being present where I was, sitting at the door, walking the road, feeding the bird, breathing through each day without rehearsing the past or bargaining with the future. And in that presence, something unexpected happened. I no longer felt invisible, not because others suddenly saw me, but because I stopped measuring my existence through their attention. The world did not need to acknowledge me for me to belong in it. The bird did not rescue me that day on the road because I mattered to everyone. She did it because, in some quiet way, I mattered to her. And that was enough to remind me that value does not come from numbers, relationships, or roles. Sometimes it comes from simply being known by one living thing in one small corner of the world. By the time night fell and I closed the door, I realized I was no longer afraid of being alone. I was only afraid of forgetting how to stay open. And as long as I remembered that, I knew I would be all right. The seasons turned without asking my permission. The heat softened, the mornings grew cooler, and the light began to linger differently on the walls of the house. I noticed these changes more than I ever had before, as if life itself was reminding me that movement does not always mean loss. Sometimes it simply means continuation. My days no longer felt like echoes of something finished. They felt complete on their own, even in their simplicity. The bird stayed. Not constantly, not predictably, but faithfully in her own way. She never rebuilt the nest the way she once had. Yet she returned to the doorway often, resting where it had all begun. I understood that she was not choosing permanence, only connection, and strangely, that made her presence more meaningful. Nothing forced, nothing owned, just a shared understanding that this place and this moment mattered. I thought less about what had been taken from me and more about what had been given quietly, without ceremony. A chance to raise a daughter who learned how to stand on her own. Years of work that, though exhausting, had kept food on the table and a roof over our heads. Even grief itself had shaped me into someone capable of deep care. For a long time, I believed my life was defined by what I lost. Now, I saw it differently. It was defined by what remained, even after loss tried to empty it. One morning, as I sat at the door watching the road stretch into the distance, I imagined my daughter somewhere far away, living a life filled with noise and movement. I did not wish to pull her back into my quiet world. I hoped instead that she carried a piece of this stillness inside her, something steady she could return to when life grew heavy. Love does not demand closeness to stay real. Sometimes it survives best at a distance, where it cannot be worn down by expectation. The bird took flight that afternoon, circling once above the house before disappearing beyond the trees. I did not watch anxiously this time. I knew the difference now between an ending and a pause. I closed my eyes and let the air move around me, feeling neither abandoned nor afraid, just present. As evening approached, she returned, landing softly near the door as she always had. I smiled without realizing it. Not because I needed her there, but because her choice to return felt like a quiet affirmation of something I had almost forgotten. That even after a lifetime of departures, connection can still find you. Sometimes it comes in the form you expect, sometimes it comes with wings. I closed the door gently that night, not to shut the world out, but to rest within it. I was no longer a man waiting for life to give him something back. I was someone who had learned to accept what came, care for it while it stayed, and let it go without resentment when it needed to leave. And in that understanding, I found a peace deeper than happiness, the kind that doesn't fade when the room grows quiet. If this story ends anywhere, it ends here. Not with a miracle, not with a reunion, but with a man who finally understood that he was never truly forgotten. As long as one living soul remembered him, chose him, and returned, even briefly, his life had meaning. And that, I realized, was more than enough.